Every year, and after many years of toil, thousands of Canadians add those three little letters after their names, PhD, in hopes of landing a job in the academy. But as humanities programs churn out the doctorates, they're not hiring like they used to. So what's ahead for those grads and for the humanities? Let's ask Paul Keene. He is a professor in the Department of English Language and Literature at Carleton University. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you.
It's nice to have you here. Before we start our conversation, I'm going to show you a graph the Conference Board of Canada put together about where Canada's PhDs end up. And I'll read you some of the highlights. So about 40% of PhDs end up working in post-secondary education. The rest are in non-post-secondary education sectors, including 17% in natural and applied sciences, 11% in law, social, community, and government services, and 2% in art, culture, recreation, and sport. When you look at those numbers, what jumps out at you?
Well, one thing about the report, and I know the report well, is what it's clear about is that the majority of people with PhDs in the humanities go on to non-academic paths. And it's actually a fairly positive report. It points out that the employment rate is really good for people with PhDs in the humanities, and salaries are strong for people with those degrees. So one of the things that it's highlighted is that we need to be a lot more aware and proactive about that whole range of positions and pathways that our students have graduated with. And the one other thing that is not necessarily in the report, but is I think it's really important to recognize, is that this is not a change. This isn't a sudden trend that suddenly the majority of people with PhDs in the humanities are not getting tenure-track positions.
It's not?
It's not, and you see that, and you're absolutely right to respond that way, because that is the overwhelming response. And I was at a conference last year, and someone showed the data, and it was really interesting. And what it said, well, it showed it for about last, say, 40 or 50 years. And over that time, it has almost never been the case that more than 20% of people with PhDs in the humanities get tenure-track jobs. So that's a half century, thereabouts. One other thing I'll point out about the report, which is interesting, is that the Vice President of the Conference Board of Canada, Michael Bloom, has a PhD in medieval history. And I've heard him talk on the subject, and he's fascinating. He said, you know, the skills I got as a medievalist really are what stand me in good stead for the job I do as a researcher, as a thinker, and as a communicator.
But what about the students themselves, the grads? Are they happy getting jobs that are not tenured?
So there's a yes and no, for sure. What's interesting, talking to colleagues like I come from an English department, but talking to colleagues in sociology and history at Carleton, is a lot of the students are already saying to professors, you know what, I'm happy. In fact, I want to go into these other career paths. They are things that I am motivated about, that I'm not seeing the tenure-track job as my main goal. Now, a lot are, and it would be hypocritical of us to tell them, don't aspire to that, because obviously we aspired to it, and we succeeded, and we cherish that, so we shouldn't tell them not to do that. But I think what we need is a more nuanced response to that question. What we need to do is, when students come in, to bring them into cultures where what they're able to do is to see a whole range of career paths and see what's exciting and satisfying and challenging about them, and how the skills that they're developing will help them get there. And tenure-track jobs is clearly that's an important one, and it's a valuable one, and a lot of students will want to have that. But what we need to do is say, that's a great one, but you know what? Here's a whole bunch, and we know about them because we know our students have actually gone into them. So we're not making it up or ad-libbing.
So from your perspective, then, you wouldn't say that there's too many PhDs?
No, I don't think so. I think that what we need to do is sometimes do a better job of integrating them into these career paths, and that means knowing more about them and finding out how to position our students to make that transition and to show why they're valuable. Now, Canada, actually, and it's another part of the Conference Board statistics, we are not on the high end in terms of per capita in the population that have PhDs. We're
Really?
sort of a little lower. We're just over, I think, 1%. A lot of countries are around 2%. So it's not like we're bloated. It's, we're probably, room to expand based on other countries. So the question is, do we have too many? It's, well, what are they doing with them? That would be really what that question would hang on. And if they're going on to successful jobs and they're using skills they developed as PhDs, and they enjoy the experience of doing a PhD, then absolutely not.
Do the students know this when they decide to do their PhD, that they might have, a problem getting a tenure job?
Absolutely. Yeah, I don't think anyone goes into it now unaware of that. I mean, that knowledge is everywhere, and I think they've known it for a long time. Now, some still, really hope to get that position, but a lot. A lot are very honest with us, saying, I understand that, and I am aware of these other options, and I want to know how to pursue them.
Okay, I'm going to play you a clip, and this is from an animated short featuring a college professor talking with one of her students about getting a PhD in the humanities.
What will you do after you spend 7 to 9 years of your life wasting away in a library trying to say something original about Emerson?
I am going to be a college professor.
You do know that less than half of PhDs get a tenure-track position? You will probably end up as an adjunct, getting paid less than many of the secretaries and janitors in the school.
I will work hard.
No health benefits. Does that mean anything to you?
Money is not important to me.
Oh my God. Who let you into this school? I'm tempted to throw you out of my office that I share with 4 other professors.
I like collaborative learning.
How are you going to pay for graduate school?
I will be a TA. And they will give me free tuition.
A TA is slave labor for the university. You will teach 50 kids in 1 semester, while reading thousands of pages a week, and writing hundreds of pages for your jaded professors who are contemplating suicide daily. You will qualify for food stamps.
I will inspire students to think critically about literature.
I know this is very serious, but that was really funny.
Yeah, it is.
Not the
not.
condition,
Yeah,
not this situation, but the characters.
Yeah.
So how well does that describe the state of PhD in humanities?
I think it's a parody of the situation. Actually, I sort of get tired of that kind of clip, to be honest with you. And I'd push back. I'd wonder why you guys want to show that clip, because I do think it distorts the situation.
What bothers you about that?
Well, I think it's a very cynical reduction of the situation. And like any cynical reductions, there's a germ of truth in it. We understand the employment situation, as we've said. But if you watch the whole clip, I mean, there's this gulf between the kind of corrosive cynicism of the professor who just is completely without any faith in any of it, and then there's a kind of banal idealism of the student who in the longer clip just keeps parroting back, I want to live a life of the mind, and it turns out she got an A in a paper on Emerson and so on. But and she, she's a parody of what that might be, and even that phrase is deliberately off-putting. What's interesting is actually that clip. There's a whole series of those movies. There's one, so you want to go to Harvard, so you want to go to law school, so you want a PhD in clinical psychology.
So it's not just the humanities.
No, so they've got a whole clip of them. But actually, I do find it a parody, and it's sort of, there's a grain of truth in it, but those aren't the kinds of conversations that go on, because I don't think our students are that dumb, frankly. I think they make the student seem kind of dumb in the way that she keeps saying, I want to live a life of the mind, and and I don't think that professors are that hopelessly cynical. They are critical of the situation, and we're doing a lot of work to help our students to figure out, what those pathways might be that will make it a rewarding experience. But to me, that is a distortion. So my question is always, like, why frame our discussion in terms of that kind of parodic image would be my question.
Well, I find it interesting that it's the professor who's tenured, who has a secure position, who's actually speaking this way to the student. Because I would think that the professor would be more optimistic because they have everything the student wants.
Yeah. Well, again, I'm saying it's not very realistic. But it's also, I think, what it's doing is distorting that sense of ethical responsibility that I think professors do have. It is our job to talk to students about what the degree will get them and what the reality of the situation is. But I don't think we do it in the tone, the insulting tone that she does.
Well, the professor says something like TA work. She describes it as slave labor.
Yeah.
Is it?
Not my TAs. No, TAs in most universities, and certainly in Canada, it's a heavily unionized environment, which is terrific, I think, because it has regulated what can be demanded of TAs. So they only work 10 hours a week, and they're frankly well paid for it. They make over $30 an hour. That's more than they're going to be making if they're doing something else. Professors are not allowed to ask them to do more than that. We have to sign a contract with the student to protect the student. And more than that, there's a lot of emphasis, and I mean a lot of emphasis on the quality with which we use our TAs. So what kind of experience are we giving them as TAs? Are we just using them as kind of marking machines, or are we trying to make them part of a more meaningful educational experience where they're serving a kind of apprenticeship? And I think certainly in my courses, that is what I try to do, and I work with my TAs, and that's certainly true of my colleagues as well.
I'm interested in you and your background. How did you get to where you are?
So I started out, my first degree was in political science, which I enjoyed, but it didn't have, and it's certainly nothing against political science, which I really enjoyed, but it felt in some ways too easy. We were all on the same kind of liberal left side on every question, and we knew we were saving the wretched of the earth and so on, and it was fun, but I felt the bigger challenge was in the humanities, or the literature side of the humanities, where it forced me to wrestle with complexities that felt a bit closer to home in certain ways. So I ended up doing my degrees in English and literature, and then what happened for me, which was a real turning point, was when I started my PhD, and I went to York in England to work with a particular supervisor who was great. We had a great experience together and so on. And I thought I was going to work on a particular thing in the Romantic period and so on. And I knew by the time I got there that I just felt like it had been done. And same old, and I didn't want to do that, but I had no idea what I wanted my research project to be, and he thought that was hilarious, and so that was great. So, but that was, I think, the best research opportunity, because what I got interested in is what people meant by the word literature. This is in the kind of years right after the French Revolution, when all the shockwaves of that kind of political event had spilled over into England, and you have massive reform movements and protests for democracy, and ideas about the power of writing were really bound up with that in ways that I think will be very familiar today. And the government was very frightened by it. Reformers were seen often branded as the equivalent of almost terrorists. They were put on trial for their life, several of them, and so on. New laws were put in banning the use of writing in all kinds of ways. And so I got interested in how those events shaped ideas about literature and why it mattered, and how ideas about literature helped to have an impact on those events. And so what that did was make me interested in this whole history of debates about the kinds of things that we're talking about now, and the fact that people were already talking about them, and with just as much clarity, and the stakes were just as high as they are today. So
this is a new old conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's important, and the same with debates about the humanities, which is sort of a similar kind of thing. It's a new old that's a great way of putting it. It is a new old conversation. People are already having these discussions. What I'm interested in is getting out of what someone called the condescension of posterity, thinking we know more than they did. That these people were living in a period of radical change, and change that was happening as fundamentally and as quickly as anything today, and where the stakes were just as high, politically and culturally and so on. And they were engaging with these kind of questions in really intelligent and wide-ranging ways. They're aware of the implications and so on. And often they're very strategic and political as well. So
I don't want you to give away everything for tomorrow's conversation. Sorry to cut you off, but we'll talk about that more tomorrow. Yeah. I wanted to ask you, what are some of the skills that PhD students have that make them an asset to any organization?
So I think there's a twofold answer to that. I think what we know, and our best information comes from the organizations themselves. And there's all kinds of surveys that come back from employers. And what they love about humanities graduates are that we are good researchers, that we're good critical thinkers. By that I mean we handle complexity well, and that we are able to deal with it without dumbing it down. And that we're, at our best, we're good communicators. We're able to tell stories based on that material, so that in a way we're able to turn information into knowledge. And in today's knowledge revolution, where there is a superabundance of information, that's a really important skill, to be able to research that kind of information of whatever kinds, and to distill it in ways which allow us to gain some kind of insight and knowledge, and then to be able to convey that both in writing and orally are really valued traits. Now, I think that the caveat there, the problem is teaching our students how to articulate those skills in ways that resonate with employers, so that they have these skills and
They don't present them on a resume.
yeah, and that's and in person, and that's often because they don't know quite what it is they know. They don't know what the skills they're developing are, because we haven't always done a good enough job in getting outside the academy to make those connections so that we can come back. And that's what we're working on right now in a lot of ways. But so that we do train our students, and it's not to turn the PhD or the undergrad degree into a training exercise at all. It's to keep the research opportunities and the experience of ideas and thinking and so on, but also in parallel with that to teach them the broader value of what they're doing. I mean, there's no easier way to kill a bright student's interest than to tell them what they're really doing is developing transferable skills, not learning about
because the idea is to be in
and so, but at the same time, if what we can teach them is, you may have been learning about the Renaissance or 19th century American literature or film or whatever it is, but actually in doing that, here are the things that you've developed really good skills at, and people value them so that they know how to articulate those. I think that is where we can do a better job.
And it's an interesting way too to expand the employment range, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. How eager are employers to hire humanities PhD grads?
There is a range on that, and I do think that is a problem that needs to be addressed, and I think that is one that you do in two ways. One through education, and one by getting more of your PhDs into these positions. Often they're afraid that PhD students will be too specialized or have inflated expectations and so on, but often employers are extremely happy with the people that they get, and that has made them far more positive about the role that PhDs can have in their organization.
And how much support is there for students within doctoral programs to pursue non-academic lines of work?
I think that's changing fast. I don't think there was always nearly as much as there should be, and I think that is a major, that's on everyone's radar right now. And again, I think the support wasn't there not for any nasty reason or pernicious reason, but because we didn't really know what that kind of support should be. But that is really changing. There's right now a major nationwide program with universities across Canada called the TRACE program. And this is a really exciting development being led by a professor in McGill University, but again, it's with participation right across the country. And what we're doing is getting tests within each university. The first phase is to pick 2 humanities programs, but then we'll expand it to all of them if we can, and get the first 3 stages. Find out where the graduates are for the last 10 years. We know who they are, so find out where they've ended up. That information is pretty easy to find on the web. It's publicly available through LinkedIn or whatever different avenues. So find that information. Second stage is to get in touch and to have a conversation with them. And these are fairly in-depth 1-hour conversations to really talk about where they've ended up and how their PhD helped them get there, but also what they wish they had known as they were going through and all of that. And then the third stage is to bring those people back to their universities or to other universities.
To work or to just...
Pardon me?
To work at the university or
no,
to network?
In a variety of ways, but say have panels or to come in maybe for 3 weeks to help with the core course in a PhD.
Right, so to keep a connection with us.
Yeah, to keep those connections, but also so that students can find out from them, here are the things that I wish I'd known, and here are the strengths that you have, and here's how you have to present them, so they get the benefit of experience. So I think there's now a lot of work going on in training our students to use the skills they've got, but we still have a little ways to go.
To what extent does the culture within academia need to change?
In a big way. And again, I think that is already happening. I think that, and we sort of alluded to this earlier, that too often it is seen that we tend to help perpetuate the idea that the real job is the tenure-track job, and then there are these other things. When I was involved in this, someone came up to me, a very well-meaning colleague, and said, "It's great that you're doing all of this because you know what the employment rate is? How many the people get jobs with PhDs in the humanities? And I know that right now the current statistic for tenure-track jobs is 14%, around that. But that's not what she asked. She said, "How many people get jobs?" And I said, "Yeah, it's 96%. There's about a 4% unemployment rate for people with PhDs." And she looked puzzled, and she said, no, it's 14. And I said, no, you said how many people get jobs, and jobs is 9. So what that illustrates, however innocently, is that kind of form of misunderstanding where she's still under the assumption that the one job yeah, and the others aren't real. And so what we need to do, and it shows because she's someone who's extremely supportive of students and extremely progressive and would want to be part of the solution, but we do have a lot of those values built in that we need to, and it's our job to examine those and to change those.
And because I was reading something that said that some students are afraid to ask for references from professors because they don't think that would mean that they're completely left the academy.
Yeah, and that I first heard that a year ago, and it really shocked me. And so there was a conference at McGill a year ago on all these topics, and one of the great things they did was bring a lot of the PhD students from across the country, invite them to come, and they participated in it. They had a one-day conference the day before, and they really kind of felt energized and licensed to participate in the rest of the conference. And that's one of the things they said. They said, you're acting like we don't get it about these ranges. And they said, as you kind of alluded to before, do students know? They said, we know what the job market is, and we know about a lot of the other career paths. And they said, but we're ahead of you. But many of us could not tell our supervisor that we're even interested in these, because we would go way down the pecking order for that person in terms of how they rank them for scholarship applications, the kind of, energy they devoted to them and so on, because they weren't seen to be as serious in their ambitions. And that was a shock to me. But enough said it. They said, it's sort of like almost, even were cases where the prof would be receptive to it. It was kind of this communication gap where they were worried about it because they didn't know whether we would be supportive. But these dynamics have been around for a long time. So what we need to do is to address them in kind of meaningful ways rather than kind of not wanting to hear from our students.
Well, you organized a conference on the future of the PhD for Humanities late last spring.
Yeah.
What was the mood of the conference like?
It was a really exciting mood, and the reason it was a follow-up to, as I mentioned it before, just a minute ago, this conference at McGill. So there was a conference at McGill University a year ago on exactly the same topic, and the organizers did a lot of really great work to kind of bring people in from right across the country. The biggest universities were all there, all the small and medium-sized ones that had PhD programs in the humanities. Also people from related organizations like SSHRC, which is the government granting agency for the humanities, Canadian Association of Graduate Studies, the Federation of the Humanities and Social Sciences, MyTax, which is another relevant group, a whole range of groups were all there. And we all got there and we're like, what is this about? We didn't necessarily all know each other. And what was interesting is how exciting the mood was. And it was exciting for a couple of reasons. One was that we were wrestling with these issues and they felt important. And we were there from right across the country, but also because people were not coming at it from a defensive position, which I think is absolutely crucial. We weren't there because we felt there was a crisis in the humanities. We felt the humanities are as important as ever. And the bigger picture, we can talk about jobs and so on. That's a really important part, but that's maybe not as important as what makes the humanities so compelling.
Now, this crisis we keep hearing, does it apply to other disciplines like
social
sciences?
Well, that's the interesting thing that I don't know enough about that. When I was talking to someone about that, we don't know what the hiring statistics are in science, in the social sciences, and so on. I don't think it's a crisis. I think that word comes up every few decades about the crisis in the humanities. There was a book in I think 1964 by a set of Oxford and Cambridge professors, eminent people, and it was called The Crisis in the Humanities. And it happened, about a century ago and so on. So you get it coming up. It came back up most recently in about 2008 in the wake of the financial collapse, where suddenly numbers for humanities, undergrad and grad, really went down because people started to play it safe and go into more obviously vocational pathways, and I get that when there's an economic crisis of that magnitude, and so everyone was talking about crisis of every kind at that point. But I think now people are saying, it isn't a crisis. That actually the number of people in humanities programs around the world is like so much higher than it was 50 years ago. It's down maybe from what it was 10 years ago, but these things are cyclical. But on the whole, if you charted it, it's not bad. That we do know that humanities graduates continue to get good jobs. It may take it more than 1 or 2 years. Whereas if you come out with an obviously a vocational thing that you do this and there's jobs for people like that, you might get a job in your area quicker. Sometimes it takes a little while, but we know from the data that we're starting to take more seriously that our graduates do fine. and that they are often very satisfied and very challenged in really positive ways by this stuff. So people aren't talking about it as a crisis as much anymore, and I think that's important. You don't do your best thinking when you're in a crisis mentality, ever, I don't think. So we got together in Montreal, and there was this feeling that this is really important, and that the humanities really matter. The world is not getting any simpler. It's a complicated world. The implications of the digital revolution are fundamental. It is absolutely changing so much about our world. And humanities are one of the most important places where we can wrestle with the implications of all of that and try to make sense of it. And so it came from a less defensive position, and then it enabled us to wrestle with these kinds of questions about how do we help our students by positioning them to move, to find pathways outside of academia? How do we make a better case and understand more clearly the public value of the humanities so we can have better conversations about it? And how can we structure our PhD programs in some ways better to align them with these discussions? So that what we felt was, that had been a really exciting conference, but these things, you get back to your home university, and most of us were sort of at the associate dean or dean level. I'm associate dean, and you get back and there's 700 letters in your inbox, and suddenly that good feeling dissipates pretty quickly. But we needed to have a conference again a year later to kind of keep the momentum going, keeping our feet to the fire, and keeping us on the job of addressing those issues. So that's why I said, well, let's have one a year later at Carleton. So what the neat thing about Carleton one was that it was a really ideal mixture of people who'd been at the conference before and fresh faces. So it had a feeling of a community and a sense of momentum that was already built in.
Paul, it's been so nice speaking to you, and there's so much to uncover, and you're going to be back on the show tomorrow.
Great.
And we'll talk some more.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.